Hello, friends. I'm so glad you're here. So, in June, we kicked off the series There Was Jesus. And if you've already heard this message, feel free to skip forward. But this month in July, we are continuing that series as we dive into people's stories, recognizing where God was in the middle of suffering, how he provided, and how his presence has brought comfort and healing. In the show notes of each of the episodes, there is a special link to a Spotify playlist I've created for you that has songs of worship around the topic of remembering, wrestling with all the emotions, and trusting God that he is present in all circumstances. Also, the podcast is now on YouTube. You can watch it and see the guests and yours truly on there. So feel free to find this Unexpected Life podcast on YouTube. For the month of August, I'm going to be taking a much needed sabbatical, and then we will be back in September for a series on caring for the caregiver. We'll be hearing from some licensed counselors, and you are not going to want to miss it. Hello there. Welcome back to this Unexpected Life podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Zoe Shaw. She is a licensed psychotherapist, author, speaker, and podcast host who coined the term complex shame. She helps women heal shame-based and codependent patterns, especially in relationships with others and themselves. She is the author of A Year of Self-Care and Stronger in the Difficult Places. She also writes the Ask Dr. Zoe column for the Grit and Grace Project and has been featured in Unlocked, Oprah Mag, Forbes, and Today.com. So our conversation today includes defining the difference between guilt, shame, and complex shame, and some practical steps that we can take to walk through healing from complex shame, especially as it relates to being a special needs parent. So enjoy my conversation with Dr. Zoe Shaw. Hello and welcome, Dr. Zoe Shaw, to this Unexpected Life podcast. It's so good to have you.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm so glad to be here. I love the work that you do, and I have a heart for special needs moms, as I am one of them. So thank you for having me on today.
So for those of you who are just meeting you for the first time, just share a little bit about yourself, family, where you're at.
My goodness, it's hard to share a little. There's so many facets. So I'm a mom of five, and I only have one daughter left at home right now. Although the other ones just kind of come and go. My son just graduated from college. He'll be here for the summer. My youngest daughter is 13. I live in California. I'm a licensed psychotherapist. I'm an author. I'm a speaker. I'm a mom of special 20-year-old daughter, Sully, and I co-host a podcast called We Are Brave Together for moms with special needs. And I also have my own podcast called Stronger in the Difficult Places, which is the same as my book because I'm also a complex shame expert. And part of my passion is really helping women understand complex shame and untangle it from their lives.
Definitely. And I can see how complex shame can be so intertwined in the life of a special needs mom, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. But before we go there, share just a little bit of your unexpected journey with us, some parts and pieces. I know there's probably been many, as all of us can attest to.
Yeah, so I'll just share as short as I can about my story, which I wrote in my book. I grew up a Black girl in an all-white farming community in rural Maryland, and that's where some of my identity shame began because I just always felt so different. I also grew up in a very fundamental Christian home. My dad was a prominent doctor in the community, and I got pregnant when I was 15. I was also in the midst of the purity culture in the church. And when my parents found out, their response was like, that's not happening here. You're a bad influence on your sister. We have to send you away. And they sent me away to a pregnancy home in Lynchburg, Virginia, a few hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours from where I lived, with the understanding that I would stay there and give birth and leave my baby there, which I did. I was a very compliant child, and I gave birth unmedicated in the hospital in Virginia, and I went home to pretend like nothing ever happened. And I didn't have a language for shame or the trauma or the grief that I was going through at that time. But I definitely experienced it, and I compensated through overachievement. I was an athlete. I, competed at a high level. I exceeded well academically. I got a scholarship to UCLA. I continued to compete, and I got a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a doctorate degree, started practicing clinically, all still carrying this deep level of shame that I was only maybe partially aware of. And it wasn't until my first kept daughter was born, Sullivan, and she was born with a very rare genetic disorder called Prader-Willi syndrome. And at that time, we didn't know what was happening, if she was even going to survive or not. And I know a lot of moms can identify with being in the NICU and all of the terror and the trauma and the fear that goes along with those days and weeks, sometimes months, even in the NICU. And during that time, that's when my shame dam kind of broke. And all of the things that I had created to hold it all up and look so good on the outside really just crumbled. And I began to identify with this deep shame story that God was punishing me and my daughter for having placed my first daughter for adoption. And so that started me on my journey to understand what was happening to me. And it took many, many, many years until, and I won't give all the details, but until I began to understand, number one, what was happening to me, how I could untangle it, and also how my shame was different than simple shame, which we can talk about over time. And so that's a little bit of my shame journey and how I've come to a place of talking about shame with a smile on my face, because there is so much joy in being able to overcome your shame story, being able to talk about it, and learning that shame doesn't have to define you.
Yeah. And I think even one of the key things that I feel like you pointed out there is the time that it takes. Because a lot of times we just want to fix it now, get past it, not sit in it. And it takes a long time. And the Holy Spirit, working and sometimes we're not ready to see all the things that he's wanting to show us, how deep rooted some of those beliefs are about ourselves and about him. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think that's so true. And that's why I'm so passionate about the work that I do, because women, men, really everybody take way too much time before they eventually, and sometimes never do, get to a point of overcoming their shame. And so my goal is to help people through it. And I know the idea of it is very scary, but the freedom on the other side is worth all of the potential fear of walking through it. So, yeah, shame is one of those things that starts so early in life. Usually, about 18 months is when we first begin to experience shame, because it is a very social construct. And because it's steeped in us so deeply, we don't always recognize it. But what we do is we do things to compensate, and we look at our relationships and enter relationships sometimes very much based on shame, but we're not recognizing it because it's been a part of our lives for such a long time.
Yeah, definitely. I can recognize even just some of that in my own journey of
Hmm.
places of shame, pain, hurt. We just want to kind of put the band-aid over it instead of like digging down into the wound and dealing with it. And so I know you mentioned that like it was obviously just like this crazy unexpected thing with your daughter that caused you to say, okay, I need to face this. And I think that's true about a lot of our stories. Most of us with our kids with disabilities and special needs, all of a sudden we're facing this wall of what we believed about God, what we believed about
Mm,
ourselves,
yes.
because our faith is so simple. Usually, we believe certain things, but then all of a sudden our circumstances don't match what we believe or what we think is going on. So I guess talk a little bit about that point and the difference between simple shame and complex shame and what that looks like.
Yeah, I want to be clear for the woman listening that even in the midst of my shame spiral, I did not have this cognitive thought of, "Oh, I really need to deal with this." It was kind of like I was just spiraling and I was trying to figure out what's going on, but I was not in a space of, "Oh, I need to work on my shame." And so if someone is out there that's listening and might recognize that they are in a shame spiral, it's okay. You don't have to necessarily be in a space of, okay, now I'm going to tackle this. The first thing is really awareness and becoming aware that the shame is there and how it influences you right now.
So you mentioned earlier there's a difference between simple shame and complex shame. So why don't you describe what that is and what
Yeah.
are the differences?
Yeah, I will absolutely do that. And I want women out there who are moms of special needs children to understand that shame is inherent in this process of parenting a child with special needs because of how society values typical development, essentially, right?
Right.
Normalcy, and I'm putting that in quotes. And so it is part of our parenting journey when we have a child with special needs. So, and I also believe when we have these types of shames, there are a lot of parents also that are probably dealing with complex shame. So the difference, let's first start with guilt, because a lot of people confuse guilt and shame and they kind of just put them together as if they're all the
Yeah.
same thing, and they are not.
Yeah.
So guilt is actually a very healthy emotion. Guilt leads us to repentance. Guilt leads us back to God. Guilt is an emotion that is separate from ourselves that says, I have done something to break my moral code, right? And there's a lot to do there. We can apologize. We can go back and fix. We can repent, like I said. So there's a lot to do with guilt, and guilt is healthy because it keeps us on the path that we should be on. Some people talk, about a conscience and just really understanding how we should behave and God's will for us in terms of our behavior. Shame is very different. Shame is an emotion, and it's also very much attached to our identity. And shame says, I am wrong. And if you are wrong, there's nothing for you to do but hide. And so shame makes us hide. Guilt leads us to repentance. Shame makes us hide. And when we hide, we don't just hide from others, we hide from ourselves, we hide from God, and it disrupts our relationships, right? So that's the difference between guilt and shame. Now, complex shame, it's very interesting because in my studies, as I was really trying to understand myself and understand my clients, I came across this book called You Are Your Best Thing by Tarana Burke. And it's an anthology. And in the beginning, she talked about having this type of shame that didn't go away with vulnerability, because Brene Brown, a lot of people are very familiar with Brene Brown and her wonderful work on shame. And Brene Brown says shame goes away when you're vulnerable and you receive external compassion, right? And Tarana Brooke was like, it's not working for me. I'm doing it and it's not working. And Brene Brown actually wrote a foreword in her book. And she said, I know my research is strong. I know it's solid. And I know what I said works. But lived experience trumps research. And so she gave an acknowledgement that there must be this other kind of thing that's going on, right? And I grabbed onto that and I said, I'm going to figure this out. What is this other kind of shame that doesn't go away with vulnerability and external compassion? And that's where I came up with the concept of complex shame. And so what I've found with myself and my clients is that when you have a type of shame, that number one, there's usually an initial shaming experience, and then you've got a lot of other experiences that kind of attach to it. I kind of think of it like a snowball rolling down a hill. It just gets bigger and bigger and bigger, right? And then it's all kind of together and convoluted. It's difficult to separate out. And so when someone who has complex shame, which often, well, there's lots of different reasons why it happens, but when someone has complex shame, multiple shames connected, when they are vulnerable, and they receive external compassion, there's a part of them that says, oh, but you don't really know. You don't really understand. If you really knew, you would not be giving me the compassion. And so they're
Mm.
not able to accept the compassion. And so the shame just goes deeper. Another thing that can sometimes happen is that someone will be vulnerable and then they will not receive appropriate external compassion.
Right.
Maybe they are gaslit for their shame or told, you don't really know what you're talking about. That's not really happening. You're making too much of a big deal about it. This happens a lot in marginalized communities. This happens a lot with special needs moms who are told that maybe they're not understanding their child right, or maybe they're over exaggerating a diagnosis, or they're doing something wrong. And obviously then your shame doesn't stay, but it just goes deeper. So those are the differences between guilt, shame, simple shame is what I call it, and complex shame.
Yeah, that's really good clarification there, because there is a lot of freedom in recognizing and naming.
Hmm. Yes.
Sometimes we just don't have the language around it. And I think it is Brene Brown that says clarity is kindness. And
Hmm. Hmm.
in having just the clear language around each of those three things, I think is just really, really important. So I know at one point you shared that you believed God was punishing you. What did that season look like for you spiritually and emotionally?
Yeah, it's interesting because a reader wrote to me, and after she read my book, and she said, God can hurt you. And she's a very, very hurt woman, and she said a lot of things. And what I acknowledged to her is we can feel hurt by God. We can feel offended. We can feel angry. And I very much in my book wrote about my anger towards God. And I went through a very angry period. I don't believe God can hurt us. That's what she was feeling. And I think we can feel hurt. And as a human, what's the difference? We don't feel the difference. We just know
Right.
we're hurting, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And so in that space, when I was really trying to grapple and wrap my head around my daughter and her diagnosis, and how my life was completely changing and what our lives were going to look like moving forward, I had a lot of anger, but I was still living in this shame based relationship with God that I was not aware of whatsoever. It took me years before I realized, oh wait, the lens I see God through is through my shame. I see him as this man God who is punishing me, who is disappointed in me, who sees me as unworthy, right? I see
Yeah.
him as that father that I will never be good enough for.
Mm.
And that's work that I had to do. My shame took me through a lot of anger, both at myself and at God. And those are things that I had to work through and be able to be in a place where I can recognize there are humans in the church who hurt people, right?
Yeah.
And often what we do is we then make an assumption that God is hurting us. And then a lot of people, as they begin to heal and grow, make another false assumption that if I'm going to be healthy, I have to leave the church. And what I really want women, especially, to understand is that you weren't hurt by God, you were hurt by humans, and humans do that because we are not perfect, and that you can have your own relationship with God. You can go ahead and evaluate what you learned and figure out if that was right or true or appropriate. And then bring all of that back to God. And you can still have a relationship with God and heal at the same time.
Yeah. And it was funny because while you were talking, I was going to ask the question, what did that shame and your relationship with God look like? What are some other ways sometimes that special needs moms, after the diagnosis, they're just trying to live life? They might be out of the hospital a
Survive.
lot. They're in survival mode. What happens? What do we do to compensate during those stages of just chaos and upheaval with our kids when we're living with that shame and carrying that with us?
Yeah. For a newly diagnosed mom, I would say your work is just survival right now. It's really just figuring out how can you wrap your brain around this diagnosis? How can you get the sleep that you need? How can you survive and give yourself grace? That's it. There are
Yeah,
periods in our life where we've got to kind of focus down, right? And sometimes emotional healing is not something that's going to happen in that space.
absolutely.
But when you get some time out, when you get months, years out, you start to feel like you have some type of handle. We'll never, because our children continue to grow and develop and change, then we'll never fully have a handle on everything regarding their diagnosis and care. But when you start to, that's the time that I would encourage you to start paying attention to your shame. And the best way that I tell people when they're like, I don't know, like, how do I know if it's shame? How do I know? Anywhere you want to hide, anywhere you feel like, I don't want them to see, I don't want them to know, I don't want them to find out, that is
Yeah.
exactly where your shame is. And my encouragement to you is just start to recognize, start to pay attention to where it is, and then remember what shame wants you to do. It wants you to hide. And so your work over time is to do the opposite of what shame wants you to do. And that's hard when we're in the grocery store and our child is, acting in a way that other people are going to be judging us. That's hard to say, how can I separate my shame from myself, right? And how can I make choices in my behavior that are not based on shame? But that it takes time. It takes a lot of time. And I can talk later too about the steps.
Yeah, something you mentioned earlier is how it's about our identity.
Hmm.
And I honestly don't think we can live here on earth and not have, unless you had very secure attachment in your relationship with your parents growing up. And most of us do not. We are, like you said, we're not perfect. We make mistakes. But I think all of us are carrying into adulthood this level of where are we finding our identity? And, is it, are we striving? Is it in our kids? Is it in how good of a parent we are? And finding ways to compensate because just of the insecure attachment that we have, I think a lot of us have when we're younger. And then all of a sudden, this is my story at least. Like, then you're just faced with this, you know, crazy, unexpected journey of raising a child with special needs and disabilities. And your whole world changes. I actually just did a television story here locally. And I said in that moment, I did not want to be a special needs mom. Like, the denial that late
Be a special needs mom, and
no,
that's okay.
because I think even that label carries shame, guilt, this identity of what did you do? Or, and like you said, and how society looks at our kids
Hmm.
when they're not valued on what you do and how you perform.
Yes.
Any
Yeah.
thoughts about what I just said?
Oh my goodness. I have so many thoughts because I'm someone who does my best to speak truth. And I try to speak the things that some people feel really hard, like it's really hard for people to speak. And the truth about being a mom of a special needs kid is it doesn't feel like a blessing and it's not a wonderful thing.
Right.
And if I could take my daughter's diagnosis away, I would cut off my arm to not have her and us as a family have this experience. And that's the truth. Now, a lot of people will say, yes, it's a blessing. Okay, we can find blessings in anything, but I want to speak the truth because I know a lot of women are suffering and feeling like there's something wrong with me. Why can't I be happier or more joyful or content in my situation, right? And the reality is because your situation is different and every single day you see other people having a life that you wish you could have, and that's okay. And there is enough grace, and God gives us enough strength, and He gives us enough resilience in all the things that we do. But it's also okay to admit, I didn't want this life, and I still don't want it sometimes. And yet I can still love my child at the same time and adore my child at the same time that I can say that about the reality of my experience. But that takes being able, I should say, that takes releasing some shame about number one, being a special needs mom, and then shame about the feelings that we have as a mom, as a special needs child. They're all there. And then let's be real, there's also judgment within the special needs community,
Yes.
right? Are you working hard enough? Are you getting all the diagnosis? Are you doing the research? Are you, all the things? And so there's so much that we have to contend with. And one of the best gifts we can do to ourselves is to let go of the shame,
Yeah.
is to ask ourselves, am I making this decision? Am I responding to this way because I feel shame about me or how I think or feel or what's
Mm.
happening with me? And if that's what I'm doing, how can I release that? How can I say the things that maybe people will have a certain thought about? And the other thing I just want to say, because I will say all the things and people will judge me, and I'm okay with it because I've worked through my shame so strongly, is that when you start to do that and you speak your truth, what you find out is that number one, all the fears that you had don't really happen. And number two, people don't care about you that much. They will think about you. They will maybe say something about you for 5 minutes or whatever. And then they go back to paying attention to their own shame and trying to do their own hiding. And so there is freedom and there's space for you to be who you are, for you to feel sadness and joy and grief and excitement and frustration and all the things. All of those are valid feelings in the space of being a mom with special needs. Well, in the space of humanity, really, just being a
Yes.
human.
Right.
But that's what I have to say about that.
Yeah. And I think one of the key thing that I'd like to point out is holding both of what we would consider,
Yes.
right, negative and positive feelings, which I don't really like to label them that way, but it's okay to say this isn't a blessing. And at the same time, I don't want this life, but then I do find joy in it. And I
And I
have
can
found
find some
some
blessings.
purpose.
Yeah.
Yeah. And
Yes.
God is present with us in
Yes.
it.
Of course.
But he's also present in our crazy, messy feelings too. In fact, I mean, that's one of the things I have found, you know, my biggest thing was I think I spent about 15 years just kind of glazing over a very specific list of diagnoses that I prayed that my son wouldn't have. And he
Mm,
experienced all of them and became medically
yes.
fragile, medically complex. But I just kept, going, God's good, God's faithful, just keep going. And some of it, like you said, like when you blessed the survival mode, I think that's something that the listeners need to hear because I think I was in it for about 15 years.
Yeah.
Absolutely, 15 years
Yeah.
until I started to notice, wait a
Hmm.
second, there's this block in my relationship with God, and I'm trying
Mm,
to strive and do all these things and fix everything. Whereas God just wants me to bring him all the messy and all the ugly pieces.
and all the
So,
anger, all the
yes,
things.
yeah. So let's talk about a couple of those steps. What does that look like? And I know it's not like just easy, nice, and neat, but I'd love to hear about some of the steps to bring us out of complex shame.
Yes. So the first step is awareness. And that's what I'm asking everyone out there to do is to start becoming aware where your shame is. And once you begin to become aware, then you can go back and understand your initial shaming experiences. What are those initial things that are tied? There's this line tied to those initial shaming experiences to how our shame shows up today.
Yeah,
Right. And so paying attention to that. And then what you have to recognize is that when we hide with our shame, we also hurt. We hurt ourselves and we hurt other people. So, in what ways have you hurt yourself? In what ways have you hurt other people? There's that saying that hurt people, but hurt people actually hurt themselves even more than they hurt other people. And so, paying attention to the ways that shame has sabotaged you. The next is deconstructing blame. And so, this is where it gets really interesting because and this is really the difference between simple shame and complex shame, because with that complex shame, I talked about that sense of, oh, you don't know. So you can't really give me that compassion. The way that our brain works with shame is that it blames ourselves. So whether we're a victim and had zero blame, or whether we've done something and may have some accountability, shame blames us as a person. And, when people come and maybe they've been victimized or, they have a lot of shame and they come to therapy, sometimes therapists will do what's very human, which is try to make you feel better, right? Try to get you to understand it's not your fault, right? The problem is that that doesn't work with our brain because our brain has already attached blame. And so what I ask you to do is something that feels like victim blaming, something that feels kind of like it shouldn't be. But what I'm asking you to do is work with your brain and actually start to ask yourself, what do I blame myself for? What do I feel responsible for? Was it that microsecond when I should have turned left instead of right? Was it that microsecond when I should have fought back? Was it this big decision? Like my big decisions was, what was it? And begin to identify all the things that you hold yourself accountable for, that you blame yourself for regarding your shame. And then I'm asking you to do something really big, which is to learn to forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for those choices, the micro ones and the macro ones that you made that you blame yourself for. Whether you're accountable for, whether anybody would say, oh, that's not your fault. I want you to acknowledge it and forgive yourself. And that's a process. And when I talk about forgiving, I love this quote by Jopalinsky, and it says that forgiveness is giving up all hope of a better past. I love that quote because it's not attached to anybody. It's not attached to yourself. It's not attached to a person who may have harmed you. It's only attached to your past, which is exactly where that thing lies, right? In your
yeah.
past. And when you can get to a point where you are no longer wrestling with your past, where you are giving up all hope that your past could have been any different, then you are on the road to self forgiveness. And so once you've been able to really work on self forgiveness, which is, a thing you have to do over and over as things come up, then the vulnerability starts to work because then you can apply the simple shame concept and become vulnerable. And what happens is that whether or not anyone gives you external compassion, it doesn't matter because you've already given it to yourself. You are no longer attaching your shame to whether somebody else is able to give you that exoneration. You've exonerated yourself. You understand also in your relationship with God that God has exonerated you.
Yeah.
And then your shame can begin to dissipate. And then we just have to work on acceptance. And acceptance is what I call like the maintenance stage of shame. Because I like to think of shame, number one, it will always be here. It circulates in the air we breathe. It is in our society. I can talk about origin of shame later if you're interested. If not, I'm sure I've written about it somewhere else. But I like to imagine that we're standing on the side of a river living our life, and shame just starts to flow by because it will always do that. And when you see shame coming down the river, your job is to recognize it for what it is and to see it and go, oh, I know what that is. That's shame. And I'm going to do the opposite of what shame wants me to do. I'm not going to hide. I'm going to speak up. And then you can just let shame flow down the river. That is the maintenance stage of shame. It's not that you never feel it. It's that you recognize it immediately when it comes up and you immediately do what you're supposed to do with it.
I talk a lot about lament on the
Mm-hmm.
podcast.
Mm-hmm.
How does lament play a role in these steps of complex shame? Did you write about that? Have you explored that piece in this journey of coming out of shame?
That's a great question. And I have not specifically, but lament, if you are in a healthy place, should be more about guilt and understanding of the human state and psychology and not necessarily about shame. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah,
And
absolutely.
so when you can get to a place of having healthy guilt over choices that you've made, over things that you've done, over people that you've hurt, and even yourself that you've hurt, as opposed to attaching it to your identity, this is who I am, then you can be in a healthy state of lament. Because remember, shame affects everything, including our relationship with God.
Yeah,
And we will go about trying to do things that we think are good, yet we've got this big shame barrier between us and God. And when we're able to release that, then we can come to God in a healthy way with who we are.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What's something that God taught you about his character in this journey of coming out of complex shame?
Mm, that's so good. I feel like God taught me so many things about his character because I saw him through the lens of an earthly father. And I think the first thing God taught me is I am your father, but I'm not an earthly father, right? I know
Absolutely.
you deeply and I'm not confused by you. I'm not bothered by your anger. I'm not intimidated by any of your feelings. And as a God who loves you, I'm here for you. God's main purpose is not to condemn us, right?
Yeah.
God actually, it's interesting because there's that whole, I think it's called worm theology, this idea that we are so unworthy as humans that, we essentially have no worth. And so therefore we have to go to God and repent, and that we only get our worth through doing that. But the
Mhm.
reality is that God saw our worth. He created us. He saw us as worthy. He
Right.
created us. And even through our sin, he still saw our worth to such a point that he sent his son to save us, right? And
Yeah.
so I learned so much about his character, and that he loves me and created me and knows who I am. And he sees me as worthy, and he's not disappointed in me. But I had to learn all of that because I was taught something very different growing up.
Yeah. I'm a little bit familiar with the worm theology, but let me just clarify this. So, if I'm understanding this correctly, the worm theology in some ways puts the responsibility back on you, that because you, in some ways, there's this, I'm so unworthy. I have to do all these things to achieve God's love. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah. Okay.
absolutely.
Okay. Do you have any
As
thoughts?
opposed to God sees me as inherently worthy. And what God wants and really desires from us is to have a relationship with us, for us to love ourselves and others, right? As opposed to I have to do all of these things to
Yeah.
become worthy enough.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Very good. Yes. Thank you. I know we talked a little bit about what God taught you about his character. We do talk a
Yes.
lot about siblings on the podcast
Mm.
because, again, I think there's still, whether we want to admit it or not, how our other kids turn out, a little bit of our identity is rooted.
Oh, yes. Absolutely.
How do the siblings
How
turn
our
out?
children turn out.
Yeah,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
did we scar them for life because they had a sibling with special needs, and how did we handle that? And so how can we be intentional as moms at not fostering shame in our children, because we carry that right into parenting our kids, and sometimes that can be brought into the family dynamic because we're trying so hard to fix the situation, maybe make it better, however that looks. Sometimes so much striving, I guess, maybe
Mhm.
in our
Mhm.
parenting. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. The first thing is that, yes, your children are different because they have a sibling with special needs, and there's
Yeah.
no getting around that. And that's just the reality of the plan that God had for their lives. And if we try to spend a lot of time mitigating that, trying to not have them have any difference or consequence as a result of having a sibling, I think we are doing them an injustice. Instead, the reality is your life is different, your family is different, your children's family is different. And this is all they will ever know because that's all they've ever known. And that's okay. And they will develop a lot of resilience. They will develop a lot of things as a result of having a sibling with special needs that they probably need for whatever they're going to do in their life. And I think us being able to kind of relax into acceptance of that is the best gift we can give to ourselves and our children, because when we're fighting so hard against it, we're just hurting ourselves.
Yeah.
The second is when it comes to passing down shame. And this is what we do. This is what we've done
Absolutely.
for since the beginning of time, is passed down shame. And it's impossible to not pass any shame down. But if you can become aware of the conversations and the way that you speak to your children, making sure that as you talk to them, you're identifying behavior as opposed to attaching any other behavior to who they are. If you can do the really hard thing of pretending sometimes like you don't have shame and acting as if, then you're doing great modeling to your kids, especially when you go out, especially when you're in society and interacting as a family, teaching them to not have shame based behaviors is helpful. And sometimes you have to act as if because you're carrying your own shame. And then, even with saying all that, I always want to give a mother grace, because we are not perfect and our children do not need perfect mothers. They need good enough mothers. And the way that I like to think about this is a net. I think of parenting as like a fishing net, right? And what's a fishing net full of? Holes.
Right. Holes.
Holes. A fishing net is full of holes. If there were no holes in the net, it actually would not be useful. It wouldn't be productive at all, right? And so I think of our parenting like that. Now, a fishing net with a gaping hole, also not useful. We don't want to put gaping holes in our children, but we will, as parents, put some holes in our children. Life will put some holes in our children. And our job is to be good enough, is to be a good enough fishing net that we raise these productive children. But we cannot, we need to give ourselves some grace, because we will not be perfect all the time. And your child doesn't need that. And that's okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so good. So we're kind of wrapping up the series this summer, and there was Jesus. Looking back at our stories of trauma and shame, and where was God in those places? Do you have a story that you can remember, maybe that you've processed, that you're like, you know what? God was there. I didn't realize it in the moment, but he was there, that you would like to share?
Oh my goodness. I mean, I feel like that's just the story of my life. God has always been there in all the
Yes.
moments that I thought that he wasn't. I think probably one of my lowest times and being my journey and maybe it was just the lowest because it was the very beginning and the worst one that I can remember. But I just remember when my daughter was in the NICU and I went into the parking lot. I was probably driving to try to get something to eat or maybe try to get a couple hours at a hotel nearby. And I sat in my car and I listened to a voicemail that a friend of mine had sent because people were calling me and I was ignoring all the calls. It was just too much. And I don't even remember what she said. I just broke in that moment. And I remember I was just screaming and hitting the steering wheel. And yet inside me at the same time, I was so angry. I refused to ask God for help. I refused to ask him to heal my daughter or save my daughter because I just believed he doesn't care. He's not going to help me. And I know looking back that God was with me in that moment and
Yeah.
all of the anger and all of the feelings that I had, God was there and he never left me. And not only that, he's continued to pursue me. It's not just that God sits aside and is just like, okay, she's in this space. I'm just going to leave her alone. God pursues me. And for that, I'm just so thankful.
Yeah. I that like I got a little teary just hearing that story because you're right. He's not just passively standing by with us. He is running hard after us. I think of
Yes.
Psalm 23 that goodness, surely goodness and mercy shall follow you is this hard chasing pursuit,
Yes.
like the
Yeah.
cheetah after the gazelle or whatever, that God is,
Yeah.
he's pursuing us. And it makes me kind of think back to something you said earlier, just about that there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. His pursuit of us has always been to rescue us. And sometimes I think it's hard for us to actually wrap our brain around that
It
from,
is.
from the beginning of creation, he knew the whole thing
He
and knew
did.
all the
He's not
suffering.
surprised.
No. And he knew the suffering and he was like, I still choose this. I often think like, knowing everything that he knows, why did he still choose to create us, create the world, and knowing Jesus would have to step in to our space and
Mm,
rescue us. It's hard to, maybe someday we'll be able,
we
I
will
know
not
someday.
understand on this earth. Yes.
Yes, someday we will. So, is there a question that I haven't asked or a word of encouragement that you would like to close out our conversation today?
I can't think of anything that I feel like you haven't asked. The only encouragement I just want to give to a mom who's listening out there is that there is hope. There is so much hope in whatever you are feeling, whatever you are going through, all the difficulty, all the maybe feeling misunderstood even by the world. There is hope. And so don't give up. Keep searching, keep pursuing God as much as He's pursuing you. And if you recognize that you have some complex shame, don't stop here. Do some of the things that I talked about today. Maybe get my book, join a membership or something, and just start to tackle it.
Yeah, definitely. I do want to ask this one last question. What has it been like for you to see God redeem your own story?
You know, it's created such a fire in me that I can't stop talking. That's all that I can say.
Yeah.
I talk and I write about it because the weight of what fell off of my shoulders and the freedom that I have now in the space of being able to live my life shame free, I just can't stop talking about it.
Yeah, I love that. So, Dr. Zoe, thank you so much. Where can the listeners find you and tell us a little bit more about your membership and what that looks like too?
Yeah, so you can find me on drzoeshaw.com. I'm everywhere at the handle Dr. Zoe Shaw on Instagram. I love to connect with people on Instagram. I have it's actually an intensive. So I just started it in June and I'll be starting it again in January. It's a 90-day intensive. It's called the Stronger Woman Intensive. And what we do is we work through in 90 days really understanding and overcoming complex shame and codependency. We didn't talk about that much on the podcast, but they do go together. And so if anyone's interested, just, yeah, reach out to me.
All
You can
right.
get my book and work on it in the meantime.
Yeah, and I'll have all the links in the show notes so everybody can find you. Well, thank you
Thank
again for being
you.
guest today. This was a lovely conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you, Carrie. Thank you so much for having me on.
You're welcome.